Chapter 3 is over contamination, food allergens, and foodborne illness. So in this chapter, we're going to be looking at physical and chemical contaminants and how we can prevent those. We're going to talk about points in the operation where food can be considered at risk from deliberate contamination. We're going to talk about food allergens, and then we're going to look at how we can prevent allergic reactions for our customers. So first item is physical contaminants. And we talked a little bit about this previous chapter, but we really focus, of course, on the bacterial and the microbes and such as well. So we want to look at what happens if we actually have a physical contamination. Physical contamination is an actual object that gets into food that is not supposed to be there. So the most common physical contaminations you can typically find metal shavings from a can opener, wood, fingernails, staples, bandages, glass, jewelry, and dirt are some common sources that you can typically find as far as physical contamination. We can also find naturally occurring objects like pits, bones, especially fish bones, or even little chicken bones or stuff along those lines, which, yes, it's naturally occurring, but we don't eat those. So since we're not eating those, that is considered a physical contaminant. Now, symptoms from physical contamination, a little bit different than what we talked about in chapter 2 when it comes to microbes. We're not going to have issues as far as flu-like symptoms or anything, but you think about these symptoms, it makes sense because of the nature of the contamination. Bleeding and pain, cuts, dental damage, choking, mild to fatal injuries are possible. Again, if you've got metal shavings, for example, that you're ingesting, those metal shavings are going in your mouth, down your, down to your stomach, into your intestines. It's working its way through. It's potentially causing issues as far as any scraping against internal organs, which can cause bleeding. And of course, you got that internal bleeding going on. There's probably some pain associated with that. If you chew down on a fruit pit, that's a really hard item that could maybe cause some damage to your teeth and maybe have to have dental work. So while it's not making you flu-like, you're not necessarily throwing up, having anything coming out the top or the bottom, it still can be concerning because it can cause pain, bleeding, that can be serious if we're not careful about it. So how do we prevent physical contamination? First and foremost, you guys have heard this a lot in chapter 2, but same thing here for chapter 3. First off, making sure you're purchasing your food from approved, reputable suppliers. So you're getting good quality product is going to make a difference. Making sure when the food is coming in, it's being inspected to make sure that there's no obvious signs of any type of physical contamination, and then taking steps to prevent physical contamination, like good personal hygiene, making sure that any work that we're doing as far as prep work, that we're removing all bones and things like that, making sure that we're wearing gloves so we're not getting fingernail pieces, or if you have a bandage on, we're making sure that's not, accidentally falling into the soup or whatever that we're preparing. Making sure you're cutting products on cutting boards. Don't cut directly onto a table or anything, because you could potentially get physical contamination that way. Making sure we're checking our can openers on a regular basis to make sure that they are nice and sharp, so we're not accidentally getting metal shavings into canned goods that we might be using within our establishment. So those are a few different things that you could be running into. And again, ways that we can prevent those things from happening. Chemical contaminants. So chemical contaminants are things such as your cleaners, your sanitizers. Those are things that we're supposed to be using to, of course, keep us safe. Polishes, machine lubricants, pesticides, deodorizers, first aid products, health and beauty products. All of those are certain things that we're see in the kitchen, but if we're not using them or storing them correctly, they can be an issue as far as a chemical contamination to the food that we're eating. Certain types of kitchenware and equipment also fall under that. So any items that are made from pewter, copper, zinc, and some types of painted pottery can sometimes leach certain chemicals and stuff into the food itself. They look nice, but they don't always work. For example, copper, you see that and you go, well, I've seen people use copper pans. They have copper pans at home. A lot of times they might be copper on the outside, but then maybe a stainless or a aluminum on the inside to help prevent issues. And the copper is not a horrible one, but anything that's really acidic can be problematic for copper and these other items as well, because the high acidity, like tomato sauces and things like that, can actually extract out natural elements within those metals, and you can have a chemical contamination because of that. So it's sometimes it said the kitchenware, the equipment, or like at the top, the picture you see there, where they're spraying, looks like a sanitizer to clean the table, but the way they're doing it does not make sense. You wouldn't want to spray a chemical in that close a proportion to open food like that, because the chances of that chemical inadvertently getting into the food, especially like that, you could tell is pretty darn high. So we want to be conscientious about that to make sure that we are not adding extra flavor, so to speak, to our product that we're serving. Now, symptoms for chemical contamination, it can vary depending on chemicals consumed. Interesting enough, with chemical contamination, most illness occurs within minutes. It's not something that has an onset or an incubation period like bacterial microbe contamination. Vomiting and diarrhea are very, very typical. So if illness is suspected, of course, we want to make sure that we're calling the emergency number in the area, especially very, very serious. Call the poison control number to make sure that we get that taken care of. Because again, the last thing we want somebody doing is getting really, really sick because of that. Ways that we can prevent. First and foremost, make sure we're using chemicals approved for use in food service operations. They also necessary for the main maintenance of our facility and stuff. So just don't buy chemical for chemical's sake. Make sure that they have a specific job that is needed for your kitchen, your dining room, whatever that may be. Of course, making sure you're getting from those approved suppliers. When you are storing chemicals, you always store chemicals away from prep areas, food storage areas, and service areas. Right? You should separate chemicals from food and food contact surfaces by spacing and partitioning. So you don't want to store your chemicals, right above where you're storing your dry goods. You want to make sure they're in a separate storage area altogether. So we actually here at ICC for culinary, we have 2 storage areas. Our main, like when we need them on a regular basis, is actually in our dish room, underneath the clean side of the dish machine area. That is just for chemicals and things along those lines. We don't store food. We don't store mixing bowls, anything crazy like that down there. Our secondary storage is actually downstairs in our equipment storage area, where we store excess equipment and smallwares and stuff, glassware, things like that. But it's, again, stored on its own separate shelf, lower level, so we're not around food or anything like that. So again, I think you kind of get the point, but just to reiterate, never store chemicals above food or any food contact surfaces. So like, for example, with the dish machine area, we have it stored underneath the clean side. You wouldn't want to store it above the clean side, because if you've got clean dishes that are drying there on the clean side and you have chemicals stored above, if some of those chemicals would happen to leak, they're going to leak down onto those clean dishes. And if you're not, the person's not paying attention, they're putting it away. And now you've got chemicals that shouldn't be on those bowls or what have you now on those containers, which are potentially then going to have food in them and going to the customer. So with chemical contaminants, the biggest thing, the best thing you can do is make sure that you are putting them, storing them correctly and keeping them out of the way of the food area. As far as use, it's just like tools. Use them for the job they're intended to do. Okay. There's a reason why it's, meant for a degreaser. It's meant for, heavily soiled, heavily greased areas. Don't use it for just general wear washing. Right. Acidic cleaner is meant to remove lime and rust and scale that you would see like in your dish machine and such. Again, it's not meant for general cleaning purposes. So making sure that you're using the right tool for the right job and not trying to do something with the chemical that's not meant to do. Only handle food with equipment and utensils approved for food service use. That's another way. Just making sure that all the equipment and tools that we're using are meant for food service operations. Sometimes we find, we can get it cheaper by using something that's used, in another industry. Well, if it's not made to the same specifications as we need for food service, you could inadvertently be transferring physical contamination or chemical contamination or even biological contamination if it's not easily cleanable and not even thinking about it. So you want to make sure you're using food service use products. Make sure the manufacturer's labels are on the original container are able to be read. We want to be able to look to see what's going on, if there's issues, what's in there, things along those lines. In fact, we'll talk about down the road, but part of our process is to make sure we have, we call them MSDS, material safety data sheets. Sometimes you'll see them referred to as safety data sheets, SDS. They won't necessarily say material. So SDS or MSDS actually is a requirement in all kitchens. We have them in all three of our kitchens, plus in the prep kitchen, plus in the dish room. And what it is, it's a list of all the chemicals that we have in the kitchens that we use. And it has the basic information about it, what's in it, how to use it, and if it happens to be ingested or in the eyes or different things like that, how to approach how we help that person that might have accidentally ingested it or accidentally gotten their eyes or on their skin if there's not supposed to be skin contact, things along those lines. Of course, we want to make sure we're following the directions and regulatory requirements when we're throwing out those chemicals as well. Some of them are just perfectly fine to put down the sink, and some of them are not necessarily, because it could have an issue with the pipes and stuff. So you want to make sure you're reading about how to dispose of those chemicals and stuff as well. Because again, the last thing we want to do is have an issue when it comes to disposing of our chemicals and we end up creating a bigger mess because we didn't just get rid of them correctly. So what happens if there's deliberate contamination of food? It's interesting. When I was in culinary school, when I was taking this originally, we never talked about, deliberate contamination of food, because why would you deliberately contaminate food? But, it wasn't something that I talked about, but nowadays it's something we need to take in consideration. First and foremost, because of terrorists or activity or activists. But then something that, again, behind the scenes, you never thought about it necessarily, disgruntled current or former staff. They're deliberately contaminating, they're spitting in the food, or, they're putting chemicals in there on purpose, things along those lines because they're disgruntled. Vendors, I would hope not, but if you've upset your vendors, maybe they're going to do something to, contaminate the food and, get you shut down. But it's kind of self-defeating if I was thinking about it, but it could happen anywhere, or even competitors. My goodness, I hope a competitor would not come in and try to on purpose make people sick at your establishment. But when people get desperate, you never know, what people may do when it comes to some of those things. So, it's things that is tough to fathom that people would necessarily do this. And we'd like to think about the good in people, but we also have to make sure we're diligent and we're verifying and making sure that these things don't happen, because the last thing we want to do is, again, get somebody sick, and especially if it's something that happens deliberately from one way or another. So the FDA had come up with an acronym. We love our acronyms, right? And the FDA acronym for a defense tool is ALERT. And ALERT stands for Assure, Look, Employees, Reports, and Threat. So Assure is, of course, making sure that we're getting our stuff from our safe sources. You hear that a lot, don't you? Right? Reputable, safe sources. Making sure that deliveries are being supervised, and making sure that your vendors are doing what they can to practice food defense as well. So for example, when they're traveling, they're making sure that their delivery vehicles are locked or sealed. So, not just anybody has access to it, especially when they're making stops, that they're keeping it, pretty locked down as much as they can to prevent any of those issues. Monitoring the security of the products within the facility of itself, limiting access to your products, especially to prep and storage areas. Locking storage areas, of course, is one way to do this, especially when nobody is around. Creating a system for handling damaged products, of course, storing chemicals securely in a different location, and then making sure you're training staff to spot any food defense threats. If there's things that don't look quite right, how do we, identify that, and what do we do with it? Employees knows who is in your facility. Again, limiting access to the kitchens, making sure that you're identifying all visitors. Anybody that you don't recognize that is in your kitchen, make sure they're being identified, and you're verifying their credentials. Is why are they here? Are they actually a vendor? Maybe somebody you haven't met. Is it actually the health department that's coming in? People like that, that's pretty easy to verify. The health departments, they all have badges and stuff that they'll usually be the first to show you, to let you know, hey, they're the health department, especially if you don't recognize them or anything along those lines. But making sure who's in your facilities. And again, the other thing too is, I know it seems weird, but it doesn't necessarily hurt to make sure you have background checks done on your staff, just to make sure that they don't have a background that would potentially be an issue for any type of deliberate food contamination. Reports wise, keep information that's related to food defense accessible. So make sure you have receiving logs, office files, all the documents. Randomly do different inspections to make sure that everything is where it needs to be. So you have your time temperature logs, not only from a sanitation standpoint, but also from that alert standpoint. So you're, again, keeping on top of things when it comes to potential contamination issues. And then the last one is threat, and that is being proactive rather than reactive. Developing a plan if there is suspicious activity or a threat to the operation. What will you do, and who will you contact if something happens? Have a plan in place. What happens if you think food has been contaminated? What is the standard operating procedure for your establishment, the SOP? How do you hold it if you suspect it's contaminated? Who do you contact? What's the chain of command when it comes to that? Do you have an emergency contact list of who needs to be contacted if there is a suspicious activity or a threat to the operation? So again, it seems like, well, that's never going to happen to me. Hopefully not. And again, most of us, we're probably going to be here in Central Illinois and right here in Peoria area for the majority of our lives. The chances of something happening, at least from a terrorist side, are pretty small. Now, disgruntled employee or something, that's always a possibility. You never know with people. But still, even whichever side it is, we still need to make sure that we are conscientious about what's going on. And as that person in charge, as the chef, the kitchen manager, you need to make sure you're aware and again, try to be proactive. Our industry, unfortunately, tends to be reactive. We don't do anything until something bad happens and then we react to it. Where if we are being proactive and we have steps in place to hopefully prevent it, and if something does happen, we know what steps we need to do in order to handle it, then it makes life a little easier. It makes us breathe a little easier when it's all said and done, because we know that if something does happen, that we're going to be able to handle it and we're going to be able to take care of it. So food allergens, right? This is just a really short part to this, but you all are going to be doing the ServSafe allergen training that you should, if you have not already purchased the thing from the bookstore, that will need to be purchased so you can access it online. Unfortunately for these trainings, most of them are done online. So I'm going to give you kind of a Cliff's Notes version, and then you'll do the full version online and get that certificate. In the state of Illinois, it is required that all food handlers have this ServSafe allergen certification. So it's not just me talking here via YouTube for you to listen to me drone on and on about allergens. It's the fact that you need to know this stuff because you need to pass this test to get the certificate, not only for here at ICC for when you're in our kitchens and going through the program, but out in the industry, you need to have that ServSafe allergen certificate. So that's why we go into it. That's why it's a required part of what you need to purchase, not only the ServSafe book, but then the ServSafe allergen access, and be able to do that. And that is part of your assignment for this week, and you get till next week to finish it up, but check out Blackboard for that information. But let's talk about allergens. What is a food allergen? A food allergen is a protein that's in food, or it's an ingredient to which some people may be sensitive to. Okay? And this is not a deliberate, somebody trying to hurt. This is not an alert issue or anything like that. These are things that occur naturally within certain foods and with certain people. If enough of that allergen is eaten, then an allergic reaction can occur. And what it is, it's the immune system that mistakenly thinks that whatever that allergen is actually harmful. And so it's thinking that it's harmful and it attacks that food protein that's in there. So it's just a case of mistaken identity. But unfortunately, that case of mistaken identity can hurt people if they eat that food that contains that allergen. To what extent, it just depends on the extent of what their allergy is, but it can be from mildly irritating to fatal if we're not careful. So what are some symptoms of a food allergen? So if somebody has an allergic reaction to food, it could be nausea, wheezing or shortness of breath, hives, itchy rashes, swelling in parts of the body, especially the face, eyes, hands, and feet, vomiting or diarrhea, abdominal pain, itchy throat are different reactions that can happen when somebody eats something they're allergic to. So when an allergic reaction happens, it can come on really quick. It's not something that necessarily builds up. Now, there are some instances where it can start off mild, but then it can escalate real quickly. If you have a severe reaction, anaphylaxis, that can actually lead to death. So, people can die because of an allergic reaction. So, if somebody's having an allergic reaction, of course, one of the first things we want to do is make sure we're calling an emergency number to get people there. If they are allergic to something, a lot of times people know it and they carry things with them, whether it's Benadryl, whether it's an EpiPen, whatever the case may be, in order to help prevent that allergic reaction from becoming worse or even fatal. Okay. So that's that reactive part. Somebody is eating something they're allergic to, and then they get sick. We need to make sure we're calling 911 and see what, if anything, they have there, hopefully to be able to get them through that so they're not going to be hurt even worse. Now, what we need to do, like everything else, is try to be proactive. So the first thing we want to look at is, okay, what are food allergens and what can be considered a food allergen? Well, technically, there are more than 160 food items that can cause an allergic reaction in people. However, 8 of them account for 90% of the reactions here in the United States. And so there's 8 of them, so we call them the big 8. And you really need to know these. You need to know what are the big 8. And again, not just for testing purposes, because it'll be on the test. I'll tell you that right now, at least my test, right? And probably the ServSafe allergen as well. But you just need to know them because we need to be aware of ingredients and stuff in recipes so we can direct people away from those items that would have those allergens in there. So the big 8 are milk, and of course, milk-based products, soy, eggs, wheat, fish, crustacean shellfish, peanuts, and tree nuts like walnuts and pecans are all part of what we consider the big 8. So milk, soy, eggs, wheat, fish. If you just say shellfish, that's a good catch-all for it. It's mostly crustacean. It's not as high as far as mollusk shellfish as far as allergens. But if you just err on the side of caution as far as shellfish, it's just a good one to remember. Fish and shellfish, peanuts, and then tree nuts, walnuts, and pecans. Okay. So how do we prevent? It starts off with the service staff. Front of the house plays a very pivotal role in preventing allergic reactions. The service staff, for one thing, they need to know what's in the menu items and know what are potentially what are the potential allergens for customers. Okay, so it's something when front of the house staff is learning the menu, that yes, they need to know what's in it so they can describe it, but they also need to know that this contains dairy, this contains fish, this contains tree nuts, so they can make sure that they are able to tell a customer that has known allergies, here's the allergies, or if they know that this person's allergic to nuts, here's the ones to stay away from because there are nuts in there. Okay? If you're knowledgeable about that, again, you can identify those items. You can suggest those menu items without it, or let them know which ones to avoid. Service staff also has a obligation really to identify the guest's order for kitchen and service staff, letting them know that somebody is allergic to something, and then making sure we're delivering food separately to prevent cross contact. It's interesting because we don't think about how everything is. We talk about how it's cooked, but we don't necessarily think about how it's prepared. The marinades that go into it, maybe a garnish or the sauce that's being accompanied could contain allergens in and of itself. So the chicken in and of itself is not necessarily an allergen, but the peanut sauce that you're serving it with, yeah, that would potentially be an allergen for somebody. Right? Making sure again that everybody is aware of what's going on makes a huge difference, especially the back of the house staff, so they know that, hey, we need to be extra cautious with this, so there's no allergens that are touching the plate or anything along those lines. In a lot of cases, it's not necessarily a bad idea for the front of the house staff to actually hand deliver the food to guests. So instead of putting it all on a tray and bringing it all out at once, actually bring it out separately, or have a follow, bring out the guest that has an allergy, their plate separately, so it's not on the tray with other items that they might be allergic to, and they're accidentally being any cross contact in one way, shape, or form. So some things that can do to help prevent these allergic reactions from happening. So that's from the front of the house side. How does the kitchen staff help prevent? The biggest thing for kitchen staff is to avoid cross contact, making sure we're not transferring the allergens from food or food contact surfaces for that. So for example, if you cook different types of food in the same fryer oil, that can cause cross contact. So for example, you see in the picture there, the basket on the right looks like butterfly shrimp. The basket on the left has some chicken. Well, they're both going into the same fryer. That potentially has now a cross contact issue for the allergen to potentially go into the chicken. So we need to be conscientious about that. And if there are allergens, in this case that you're frying, make sure you have a separate fryer to fry those in, to make sure that we are not doing a cross contact to go along with it. Okay. We also don't want to put food on surfaces that have touched allergens. So if cooking equipment, utensils, or other surfaces have touched an allergen, then it can cause cross contact. So for example, if you are making cookies, make peanut butter cookies, you use parchment paper to help them from sticking and make cleanup easier. Well, if you reuse that parchment paper and then do chocolate chip cookies on that same one after you did peanut butter cookies, you've done a allergen cross contact. And so those chocolate chip cookies potentially have peanut residue on them, which could then cause an allergic reaction for somebody. Okay, so we want to make sure we're not touching anything has an potential allergic reaction, that we're not cross contacting those items. Another thing we can do, of course, is we can check our food labels for allergens. Chances are we're not making 100% of our things from scratch. And so we're bringing things in, and sometimes we don't make stuff from scratch. You're not making Worcestershire sauce from scratch. Well, most Worcestershire sauce actually uses sardines or anchovies as one of the ingredients. It helps to bring out the saltiness and adds some umami to the flavor profile. Well, if you have a fish allergy, guess what? Worcestershire sauce you shouldn't be eating. Now, they do make Worcestershire sauce that they do not use fish as one of the ingredients in there, but you need to check. How about your Worcestershire sauce at home or at work? Is it one that if you gave to somebody with a fish allergy, would that make them sick? Food for thought when it comes to that. All right. So it's important that we're checking the label for the food allergies and things along those lines, just to make sure that they're, especially the big eight, if they're there, that the front of the house staff is aware of it, so they can let people know if people have those allergies and stuff. Okay. So basic ways on how we can avoid cross contact. Again, we've already talked about, but checking the ingredient labels, checking the recipes, what items have allergens in it, making sure we're rinsing, and sanitizing cookware, utensils, and equipment. And it's just not wiping those down. It's the full wash, rinse, sanitize. Okay. That helps to prevent cross contact. Okay. Make sure that the allergen doesn't touch anything for customers with food allergies. Be especially aware of that. In a lot of kitchens anymore, they'll actually have certain setups. So they'll have like color coded cutting boards that allows, okay, the stuff that's on this cutting board is something that does not contain any of the big eight. So it's ones that are more for those that are have allergies, more allergen friendly, things along those lines. In some instances, especially when you get into certain populations, like young kids, elderly, those that with compromised immune systems, kind of like with the biological contaminants, with allergens, a lot of times those restaurants or those kitchens will even have ways that they can separate things out altogether. So those that have peanut allergies, there's bowls and stuff that are not used for anything that contain peanuts or nuts, things along those lines. The other way you can look at it too is some things you can just not have. Maybe your restaurant, because you find you have a lot of people that have nut allergies, maybe your menu does not contain any nuts. Okay. So that's another way that you can look at it as well. Of course, washing your hands, changing gloves before prepping different foods. We talked about using the separate fryer and cooking oil for those with allergies. Label food packaging on site for retail use. If you're doing anything for a retail side, of course, you always want to make sure on the labeling that it does point out whatever allergens might be in there. Yes, people should be looking at what ingredients go in, but it's kind of nice to, contains nuts, contains dairy, just a real quick thing. So people that have those allergies can look at it and they can see real quick whether or not it's something that they can eat or something that they should avoid. So chapter 3 is just, we finish up the 3 basics as far as the biological, the physical, and the chemical contaminants. Again, biological is our biggest one because of foodborne illness, because of bacteria and viruses and stuff. But we don't want to forget about the fact that we don't want to make people sick because of metal shavings or wood pieces or bones that they might be eating, or that they're having a little bit of extra Clorox to go along with their soup that day. So, we don't want to forget about those two, the physical and chemical contaminants, because it is something that's important as well as those biological when it comes to it. Again, we hope that we don't have to worry about the alert system and that we have to worry about food being damaged or anything like that intentional. But again, we still need to make sure we're being vigilant in that so that people are not getting sick because of an intentional act. And then food allergens. It's here, ladies and gentlemen, whether you like it or not, how much it might annoy you or anything like that. People have allergies, your friends, your family, maybe yourself. You have allergies, and we want to make sure that we're taking care of our customer. Remember, we are in the hospitality industry. Our job is to do everything we legally can to make our customer happy. And if that means that they're doing a dish with no nuts in it, that means there's no nuts in it. Now, there are things that, people have to understand too. If it's prepared that way, you can't take it out, then just make sure that your front of the house staff knows those things and such. But if there's ways that you can make it able for somebody to order because all you got to do is just leave this out, try to think of it that way in that case, because it's going to open up those options for those people that have those allergies, and they'll remember it. They'll be thinking about that stuff. And when they're going out to eat again, they're like, hey, we went to this restaurant. They have a lot of great food, and they're really great to work with as far as with my allergies, and very accommodating. Let's go back and spend my hard-earned money with those people because they treat us so well. So again, things to take into consideration when it comes to contaminants, when it comes to deliberate contamination, and when it comes to food-based allergens.